Hello, this is Dan Pro. I'm going to do a tutorial to help a forum member at blunderartist.org with his piston rig here. And just a few things before I get started. One thing that I noticed is he's using a empty for a controller, and that's probably one of the worst things you can do. We also have an armature in here. There's no reason to mix empties with armatures. I think it just complicates things unnecessarily, and let me just show you a quick thing of why empties aren't very good for rig controls. If I do Alt G, R, and S, you can see that that empty disappeared, and where it went was the center of the world. So whenever you clear its rotations, locations, or scale, it's going to drop to the center of the world. So basically there's no rest position for an empty, and it makes it kind of difficult to work with. So that's one reason not to do it, and another reason is it's going to complicate the animations in the end. For every empty you have as a control, you're going to need a separate action for that control. So you already have an armature object, and armature objects are the only thing in Blender that you can key multiple things, and that means the bones within that armature in a single action. So if we had two arms and they were both controlled, like this left arm here, and we had an arm on the right side, and they were controlled with empties, we would actually have to have two separate actions for a single animation, which doesn't seem like very much, but once you start adding up, start getting more complicated rigs, that's really going to add up quickly, and you can quickly find yourself having 10, 20, or 30 different actions for something that we could basically have a single action by using an armature. So let's get in here, and I can show you what I come up with here on another layer. Get out of wireframe mode here, and basically I think this is what you were looking to have accomplished. I've just got a single target here, so I can pretty much rotate this all around, and this piece is only going to rotate on this single axis. This piece will also only rotates on that single axis within that slot, and I can rotate that around, and this will rotate as well. So, and I found a way to get this to work all the way around in negative space and be pretty and work pretty well. And you can also see if I get this tight here, it actually stops, and it will not, this arm will not intersect that cube mesh there. There is one thing, we can make it intersect, this arm intersect, but if that's going to have to be on the animator, we just need to make sure that our target, our IK target here, is not ever going to intersect that, and that shouldn't be a problem. So I'll show you how to set this up, and let's get going here. I'm going to use the actual meshes here that were provided by the forum member. So I'm going to grab this control and try to get this arm straightened out here a little bit before let me go to side view maybe. Alright, trying to get this thing all straightened out. I'm gonna also make a few changes to these objects, mainly because IK chains do not like to be straight, and I noticed this was originally, if I just tab into, let me grab that armature, tab into edit mode, this is a perfectly straight bone chain, and that doesn't work well for IK chains. Let me get back out of there. I think I've got that about as straight as I'm going to do. Let me do GZ, straighten this arm out. Alright, I'm going to start more like this, so I have a slightly bent arm. I'm actually going to do a little bit more here, but first let me select all of these mesh objects, the cube, this little rotator here, and these two little arms. I'm going to do Shift D, and I'm going to move them to new layer so I can just work on them. One thing I want to do is I want to make sure that all these meshes are cleaned out and they're not parented to anything, and pretty much undo any prior parenting or constraints or anything like that. So I'm just going to select them one by one and go through, and I want to select the object constraints, make sure there's no object constraints on there. There's not on that mesh. Then I want to go to the modifier tab and make sure there's not an armature modifier, and this one is fine. and also I want to delete any vertex groups or shape keys. So that cube is fine. Let's go select the next mesh and just repeat that process. I see that there are object constraints on here. We're going to use an armature with armature constraints, and they have their own tab. Let me just grab this other. You can see that this is an armature, so it has armature constraints over here. So we don't want to have object and armature constraints both fighting each other here. So that's why I want to delete this limit rotation. And I'm going to come back to that limit rotation thing in a minute here. We continue on, make sure that our modifier stack, I'm actually going to apply this armature modifier just so it keeps that position. And then I'm going to delete all the vertex groups. I'm going to use a different parenting method here. So delete that group. Now let's select this first arm. Repeat the process. There are no object constraints. I'm going to apply the armature. Delete all the vertex groups. Alright, and then one more thing. And I notice that there's a, see it's kind of discolored compared to these other objects. And the reason for that is there are flip normals. So I'm going to select this object. I'm going to go into edit mode of that object, select everything, and go to my shading and UVs tab in the tool panel, and T to open up the tool panel. I'm going to recalculate that, and you can see that that color changed there, and that was because those normals were flipped on that object. So now I can continue on and delete those vertex groups. Oops. I want to start at the beginning here, make sure there's no object constraints, then apply that armature, then I'll delete those groups. Alright, I think that should be, that's nearly all of it for our mesh. Clean up here. I'm going to select everything and do Alt-P, clear parent, and keep transformation just to make sure that everything's clear. Double check. And one other thing I like to do is always start my rigs with my mesh items sitting on the grid floor. So let's go to display. I want to turn on, make sure grid floor is on, and I've got all my axes. I can see the X, Y, and Z axes of the world. I'm going to select all of those mesh objects, type GZ, and grab them and locate them so the beginning of these meshes, the main mesh here that everything is built off of, this cube, is sitting on the grid floor. And then you can see that I've got unapplied location and scales for some of these meshes. So I'm just going to use A to select them all, and then do Control A, apply location, and then I'll just check rotation and scale. Now you can see every one of these items is zeroed out for location and rotation, and 111 for scale. Scale of 1 in Blender means unscaled. So these objects are now ready for rigging. I can actually lock them, all the transforms in there, because we never actually have to manipulate these in object mode from here on out. The armature modifier, or our armature, is going to take over from here on out, so we don't have to manipulate these things. Actually, I do need to make a few changes for these arms, because like I said earlier, I want to kind of make a little bit of a bend here. Let's uncheck this one here too, because one thing I want to do is actually, I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm going to turn this section 90 degrees. That's just going to help with my rig here in a minute. So I'm going to select all the vertices in there, Shift S, cursor to selected, and that put that cursor right at the center of that mesh. Side view here, I'm going to type RX90. Oops, what pivot point am I on? I should go to 3D cursor, RX90, and spin that around. This is just going to simplify things for me a little bit later on. Alright, now I can apply or lock those transforms, and I want to do a little bit of manipulation here. I'm going to take this end mesh and type G, Y, and drag this down a little bit, because I want to put a slight bend in between these two joints here. So with my pivot point at 3D cursor, I'm going to select the second arm and just type RZ and rotate that slightly, and then I'll realign these here. I'm just going to do this by eye. Line these back up. G, X, Make sure they're sitting on top of each other. So now I've got a slight bend there. Well, that's a severe bend for this one, but a slight bend in that first joint. Alright. Let me just do Control A, location, rotation, and scale. Make sure all that stuff is applied again. And then I can just lock all these transforms. Like I said, we don't have to manipulate this thing in object mode anymore. Alright. Shift S, cursor to center, and we can add our armature. So Shift A, add armature, single bone. And we can't see that through our mesh, so I'm going to go to the armature tab here, the little man icon, go to display options, and turn on X-ray so I can see it. And then axis display, so I can see the axes of all the bones when we're adding them. Here in a little bit, I want to move this armature object underneath these meshes. I like to have them separated, so my meshes are on top, and the armature that's controlling them underneath, so I can toggle them on and off. Alright, let's go to edit mode of the armature. And if I forget to say, if you see the bones and they are orange, I am in edit mode, and if they are blue, I am in pose mode. Let me actually turn my pivot point to individual origins. Alright, so edit mode. First bone is going to be the root bone, one of the most important bones in our rigs. Let me get our display out here. So this first bone is called bone, let's call it root. And then I'm going to select that tip, RX -90, and you can see that the axes of those bones are aligned with the world now. The Y is going with that green line, which is the Y axis of the world. Our X axis is aligned with the X axis of the world, and Z is up, that blue line. Alright, I'm going to front orthographic view. I'm going to do Shift D to duplicate that bone, and then GZ. I'm going to drag this up to about the center of that box, and this is going to be that body bone, or box bone. I'll just call it body. I want to parent that to a root bone, so I'll select that. That's going to be the child of the root, the child first, then the parent, which is the root bone. Control P, keep offset. I don't want them connected in this instance, so now I've got a body bone here that I can rotate independently, and if I grab the root, it'll go with the root. Alright, let's get in here and start adding bones for this arm. So I'm going to select this mesh object, and I'm actually going to go to side view here, make sure that I can see through everything. I'm just going to box select all these back rings here. I know this might not be too, I didn't get them. I need to turn that option off, and you can see that all these back rings are selected. Do Shift S, cursor to selected, and that will put that exactly at the center of that joint there, or what will be a joint. Now I can go back to my armature object in edit mode and Shift A, add a new bone. Let me just go front view here, select this top one, and do RY -90, nope, RY 90, and then I'm just going to go to top down mode here, top down view, and just kind of drag this to the center of that mesh. And also what I want to do is I'm actually going to drag the head of this bone in here. I'm going to, you'll see why here in a minute. So I'm just going to do GX, so that's straight. I'm going to go about right at the center of where that bevel is for this box. I'm going to select that whole bone, type W to subdivide it. I'm going to select that center point, GX, to get right at the edge of that box, and then GY. I'll straighten that bone out again. About right there. Now I'm going to extrude another bone with E, and then GY to drag that all the way to the end of this other arm. Just grab this and center it just a little bit. Alright, next thing I want to do is set all of my axis rolls, and I can see on this little tiny bone here the Z is coming forward and X is going down. I actually want Z to be up, so I'm just going to type 0 in my roll value here. Or you can also select the bone and do Control R, and you can set your rolls from there. The main thing is I want my X facing straight forward and Z to be straight up and down, and now I need to make sure that these other bones are aligned like that as well. So I'll select the end bone, the middle bone, and then the one that I just rolled last, and that makes it the active bone. I'm going to do Control N, recalculate roll to our active bone, which would be that one that I rolled there, and now all of these other axes are aligned. So every bone in this chain, the Z axis is going up, X is going forward. Now we're turning a corner here, but Z axis is still up and X is going this way. So basically it's all relative all the way around, and that's what we want for our bone chains when we're adding IK constraints. It helps make them work a lot more efficiently. Now what I can do is actually one more thing. I want to take this little tiny bone here at the start. Let's actually name these, and they were named wing on the other armature, so I'm just going to go with that name. So I'm going to type wing .001, and then just hovering over that name, I'm going to do Control C to copy it, and then Control V to paste it to these other ones. So I'll select the next one there and Control V, and that name them sequentially all the way around. I want to select this first bone in the chain, wing 001, and I'm going to parent it to the body bone. So child, then parent, Control P, keep offset. Now let's get our meshes moving with these bones. I'm going to select the cube and then select the body bone, and you'll see that this other bone's lit up. The one that I selected last, which was the body bone, is the active bone, so that's what it will be parented to. Do Control P, set parent to bone. Now if I grab that bone, you can see that that mesh is going with it. I'm just going to repeat that process. I want this parented to that first bone, Control P, bone. This next arm piece parented to this one, Control P, bone. And then this last one parented to the last bone there, Control P, bone. Now if I rotate these, RZZ, that's going with it, and RZZ, that's going with that one. And if I get this little tiny one here and type RYY to rotate around its local Y axis, you can see that that is going with that. So now we've got that set up. Let's clear all our rig controls, Alt G, R, and S, and we need to add one more bone here to make our IK constraints work. So I want to select this bone, select the tip of it, actually have that mesh selected here, deselect that first. Alright, just select the tip of this end bone, and I'm going to type extrude and then GY, and I'm going to bring a bone back the other direction. And the reason I'm doing this is basically this is going to be a location controller, so I'm going to call this IK.target, and it's a, like I said, it's a location controller, and I always like to position my bones in edit mode if they're location controllers where their axes are aligned with the world. So this is basically facing just like the root bone is. So Y, Z, and X going this direction. So it just makes more sense and everything. One thing that we need to do when we are adding IK constraints is our IK target cannot be parented to any bone that it's going to affect. So our IK chain is going to affect 3 bones here, but we can't parent our IK target to any of those bones. It has to be parented outside. So let's go back to edit mode and select our IK target 001, and we'll parent it to the body with Control P, keep offset, and now we shouldn't have any problems with our IK constraints. Let's add that constraint by selecting the IK target bone in pose mode, and then we'll shift select the last bone in that 3-bone chain for the arm. Do Shift Control C, add constraints with targets, inverse kinematics, and we can go to our constraints tab here and we can start looking at that. A chain length of 0 means that that IK constraint is going to work all the way back through the chain until it gets to the rootmost bone, which is called root, and we don't want that. We only want it to affect 3 bones here, this one, and this one. Let's check this out. You see that it's working, but our meshes are not rotating correctly, so let's start fixing that. And we can do that by locking some of the the transforms in the inverse kinematics panel. Now, inverse kinematics is a special constraint in Blender, and it always gets evaluated last in the constraint stack, not only on the bone that it's on, but on every bone that it gets affected. And basically, long story short, the reason that's important is we can't use limit rotations on any of these bones that are being affected by an IK constraint, because they will basically just be overridden. They're actually working, but then because IK constraints always get evaluated last on every bone that they are affecting, they basically just get overridden. So in order to fix that, there is a special spot for setting things like that up, and that is right here in the bone properties. So we'll select that first bone, go to the bone properties here, and we can actually lock our axes here, and you can see there's also stiffness values, and we can also limit their rotations from here, so we don't have to use limit rotation constraints. We can do that right from this panel. So this first bone here, we only want it to rotate around its Z axis. You can see that it's pointing straight up here, and actually I think Blender is actually kind of screwy here. Have this bone selected. It's displaying those axes at the tail, but it's actually going to rotate from this end, the fat end of the octahedral bone here. So that's why I always like to use octahedral mode, so I can see where that fat end is. That is the money end. That is where a bone rotates from. If I just go to select this body bone, I can show you. If I select it and type RX, it's going to rotate that from the head, not from this tail. Let me clear that out. So one little odd thing to keep in mind. So this Z axis is actually here, and that is the only axis we want this to rotate around. So we will just lock X and Y. We'll select the next bone in the chain, and we can lock the Z axis here, which you can see it out here, but we need to kind of imagine it back here at this head. We can lock X and Y over here, and then this final little tiny bone here, we only want it to rotate on its local Y axis, so we can lock X and Z. And now let's take a look at what happens here. Let me actually just hide these two bones here so they're not in our way. So we'll grab that, and you can see that this bone is staying within that slot because it's only allowed to rotate on that single axis. This one is only rotating around its Y, so it is swinging that first piece there, and this one is only rotating around its Z axis, which is out there. So there we go. But there's still one little problem here, and you can see if I get to the back here, it'll flip around, and that might not be what we want. If you're only going to be using your IK chain out front here, you can probably just leave this just as it is, but there's another solution here we can add to stop that bone flipping here. Alright, I'm going to just unhide everything again, make sure everything is cleared out. I'm going to go back into edit mode. What I want to do is add a bone. I'm going to pick the head of that little tiny bone there, and I'm going to extrude it, and then G, Y, I'm just going to drag it out front. I'm going to switch the parenting around here a little bit. I'm going to make sure that this is parented. I'm going to call this MCH wing.001. I'm going to make sure that's parented to the body bone. It should be, because I extruded it from that one, it already should be, so I'll select that. And then our body bone, Control P, and I'm only getting the connected option, so that means that it is parented with keep offset. You can always check that in our bone properties here. So select that bone, and let's look at what it's parented to, and it is parented to the body, and it's not connected. So that's what we want, but I need to change this one to be parented to that MCH bone. Control P, we'll keep offset, and now what we're going to do is actually have this bone also, we're going to add an IK constraint, so this bone will also try to point at that target. So let's select our target, then the MCH wing bone, Shift Control C, add our inverse kinematics, and you see everything went wacky there, and that is because that chain length is at 0. We want that to only be at 1. We only want it to affect that single bone, but we don't want it to cant off to the side like this. So what we're going to do is go to bone properties and go back down to our inverse kinematics panel, and we only want it to rotate around its x-axis. So if I click off Y and Z, you see the x-axis is pinned right here. Now if I grab this and rotate around, it's trying to point at that that target as well, but because we're only allowing it to rotate on one axis, it's basically it's not a, you can see that there's no movement to the side here. It's only rotating around in a circle, and that is going to fix our problem. Basically what's happening here is this IK bone, this MCH bone, is trying to point at this, so we're getting basically a lock track kind of a constraint happening here. But because this bone is parented to this one, it is only going to rotate around its local y-axis, and so we're getting the correct movement, and it's a lot more smooth, and we don't have that flip out towards the back. IK constraints work from the pose position, and that can be a lot to handle. I'm not going to explain all that now, but basically that's what's happening is because this tiny little bone here is parented to this one, it is going to rotate with its locally because it's parented to it. So there we go. Now it's not flipping out, and we can get that works perfect. Like I said, one thing that you have to be careful of is you don't actually take your IK target and go inside this mesh here. One more thing we can do here. I didn't set up my axis or my limits here. We don't want to, if we grab this bone here, we don't want to push that inside there, and we can actually use our limit constraint. The limits, we select the bone, go to bone properties, and we can limit that z-axis here. Let's limit it to -85 and +85, and now when I grab that control, it will stop without intersecting that body. So there you go. That should work for you. It's pretty easy to set up. Like I said, IK constraints are special constraints in Blender. You've already ran into those problems. Just be aware of the special things you need to do in order to make them work. I hope this helps. Good luck.